Jessica Russo Scherr, and I'm here to teach you a few easy techniques to get you started with watercolor. These few techniques are things that I teach in my classes on ways to really understand how to use the material. I will talk about the materials you need to work with watercolor, brushstrokes and techniques to help create interesting and easily achievable watercolor paintings that you'll feel proud of, and how to actually apply them not just on their own when you're practicing, but together to make an artwork. Here are some of the basic art supplies you will need. Watercolor paper, it should be thick enough that it doesn't buckle. Soft brushes, certainly more expensive watercolor brushes are going to be amazing to paint with, but just as long as you have soft enough brushes to work with the paint. And water. It also helps if you have some paper towels handy. Those are the basics. Now your watercolor could be pan watercolor like you see here, or it could be watercolor that comes in a tube. Either is fine. I will also teach you which color in your watercolor palette you should never use. In fact, which one I actually throw in the trash. For this demonstration, I'm using a student grade Watercolor-Pans, and they come in this foldable kit that has a metal palette on it, a little thumb thing to, so you could hold it on the go in case you need to paint outside or when you're traveling. And they have the small little watercolors that are refillable. I really like this set because you can replace or add other colors. First, wet your brush and then gently pet the paint, kind of like you're petting a puppy. You don't want to use the paintbrush like a screwdriver where you twist it. When you're first starting with watercolor, let yourself experiment. Let yourself try to just see how the different colors work. Right now I'm just making a color chart where I'm having slightly more concentrated color toward the top and then adding more water so I can see how the color lightens up. And that's really how you're going to lighten up all of your paint, is just by adding more water. So I threw away the white paint and I never put the white watercolor paint out. Of course, there's exceptions to this rule, but especially if you're starting out, do not use the white watercolor paint. And this is why. All you have to do is use the water. Keep your water clean, but just add more water and the color will be lighter. If you actually use the white watercolor, it makes your paint more opaque or less see-through. And you can see that in this example that I'm working through. Even though I keep on adding more white and more water, my paint doesn't quite get that thin, transparent light pink that I'm looking for. You don't have to worry about getting your other pans or cakes of watercolor messy. That's okay. Dip into them, use them, because it only takes a tiny bit of water to clean them off. And it's important to mix your colors. You don't want to use only the colors that the manufacturer gave you. You want to use colors that you create. So have fun and experiment with the color. The first thing you have to understand is the name of the material is watercolor. And water comes first because that's the most important part. Focus on the water part and less on the color. Right now I'm using a technique called wet on wet. I'll be taping down my paper since I'm using a lot of water and the water can cause it to buckle. You can also use a watercolor block, which is a block of or a pad of watercolor paper that's secured on multiple sides, and that keeps it from buckling and getting wavy. Apply your water liberally, make sure it's clean water, all throughout your paper. And the color will spread out onto the paper, just like this. Because there's so much water already on there, the watercolor just spreads out and you can add other colors in. I like to drop color in and let it spread out and mix on the paper. You don't want to overdo this because it can get to be a little much. Here I'm flicking on a little bit of color to add some more texture. You can do some lifting by using a paper towel to blot up areas that are too watery, or you can press really hard and actually lift the watercolor off of the paper to create texture or lighter areas. Remember, the watercolor will look different once it dries, and once it dries, you get that satisfying tape reveal. Now you can see some watermarks and areas where you get these beautiful fading lines from the dried watercolor. Think about how you can use that to enhance your paintings rather than trying to avoid them. When using wet on wet, you don't have to necessarily wet the entire paper. You can just wet certain parts, and the watercolor will be restricted to those areas that are wet. It will bleed into those areas, and you can have a lot of fun with it. I like to use this technique for skies because you can just wet an area and leave some areas blank that'll end up being your clouds, and just drop in a little bit of blue and move it around, and when it dries it looks like a beautiful sky. The next technique is called wet on dry. You use this technique when you want a little bit more control, when you want to know where the paint is going and not have it bleed out into other colors. It's important that your paper is dry, and obviously your paint will be wet. So if you have a concentrated color and you do wet on wet, it will start to bleed out the bottom. So you can start with wet on dry and then add more water to the bottom. And then as long as that first bit of watercolor is still wet, it will slowly leak out the bottom. And you don't have to use the same color with this. You can add other colors to really create a cool effect. This next technique is called dry brush, and that's because you start with a dry brush. The watercolor is not going to be dry, but the brush is, and therefore it's not going to spread out on the paper. You'll get a lot darker, more saturated, concentrated color. And as you keep on wiping the brush on the paper, you get scumbling. You get these kind of hints where you can see the texture of the paper. Here's a demonstration on how I used wet on wet to create a sphere with shading. I block out the circle with water, and then I add my color. I add more color in the shadow areas, and I constantly build that up. Once one area is dry, then I can work on the other area. I want to be careful not to work on an area adding more water to it if the watercolor is still wet next to it, or else it'll bleed right into it. It doesn't have to be 100% dry, but it needs to be dry enough. You'll notice that when the watercolor dries too, it changes a little bit. You might get these watermarks, or some areas might appear a little darker or lighter, and you just have to go with that. You just have to go with the flow and see what you can modify, where you might be able to adjust the color a little bit, or just say, you know what? That's the way it's going to be. That's the texture of it. I'm using wet on dry technique with a pulling motion to create these leaves. And that means that by placing my brush down firmly first, the color is going to be a little bit more concentrated there. And then as I pull it and lift it up, the color will get a little lighter. Now that the leaves are done, I'm going with wet on dry to add some branches. Now my green is still a little wet, but not enough for the brown to fully run into it, just enough for the edges to kind of blend in. The pulling method with wet on wet, where I add in some petals and I drop in color to make it a little bit more intensified in the shadow areas, or just for some variation. I'm very careful to leave some parts of my paper white so I can get some negative space. Once it's dry, I can go in and add more leaves and details. Here are some tulips that I'm using a similar process with. It's a little smaller, but I'm dropping in more concentrated color toward the bottom so it creates more of a shadow. And just trying to be loose and free with my paintbrush strokes. Now you'll notice that I didn't wait for my petals to be dry, so my stems have a little bit of the purple in there, and I like that. Once it's dry, you can go over it with a fine liner to kind of firm up some of your shapes as well. Let's say there's something that you want to paint, but you really want to preserve the white of the paper. There's masking fluid for this. It's a great tool, and it comes in a liquid form. This particular one is in a pen form, and you can see it's kind of got this bluish color to it, but the blue color won't stay there. You just put it on wherever you want something to be white, where you want the color not to affect the white of the paper, and you paint directly over it once the blue stuff has dried, once the masking fluid has dried. And then you use your finger to rub off the blue stuff. It's kind of like gummy texture, and it comes right off, and you have crisp white paper right underneath. Now you could always choose to go over those white parts with another color, and that color will appear brighter than if it was on top of the colors that surround it. So here's how you apply those techniques to a painting of a tree. I'm using wet on wet. Yeah, my water's a little bit blue, but that's okay because I'm doing a tree, and blue is part of green anyway, right? I'm just dropping in different colors. I'm paying attention. I want my light source to come from the left-hand side, so I'm adding more of my light greens on the left side and more of my darker greens and blues on the right side to create the shadow. I have some little dips and dabs of green out on the sides to create just random leaves. And then I start working on my foreground. And this, I'm just pouring in tons of color. Now, one of my favorite techniques for painting is using salt. So if you want to create texture on a painting, all you have to do is do a lot of wet on wet and keep highly saturated colors. And then you apply salt to it. The thicker the salt, the larger texture you will have. You put it on there and then you carefully put it aside, and you don't touch it until the whole thing is dry. So you know, like when you have salt, when you eat salt, you get bloated. It all absorbs in you because salt absorbs water. And that's exactly what it does with the watercolor. The watercolor is pulled to the salt, and therefore when it dries, it'll dry with these sort of rings around each of the salt crystals. I have a video tutorial on how to draw trees, so if you need help with this part of the project, just check that out. And then I use mostly wet on dry to create the branches, but it was really important that I wait until all of the leaves and all of the ground were dry. Otherwise, the brown would just leak right into both of them. I waited until everything was dry to add a little hint of sky behind it using wet on wet with very, very, very little blue paint. Another way that you can add really cool texture is by placing plastic wrap on top of very wet, saturated watercolor. If you let it dry all the way, it creates cool textures, but even if you let it dry part of the way, like I did, you still get these really cool geometric sort of natural formations. And remember, watercolor always looks a little bit different once it's fully dry. A major misconception about working with watercolor is that it's for little kids. You know, it's one of the first paints most children ever try, but it takes some time, some sophistication to be able to use it properly. And it can be a little frustrating because we have this preconception that, oh, this is something that kids use. Why can't I do it? I paint with acrylic and oil, and I think watercolor is probably the most challenging of all of them. And that's because you have to let go. You have to allow the watercolor to take control and let it do the work. And letting go is not always the easiest thing to do. Cleaning up your watercolor palette is very easy. Just grab a damp paper towel and wipe it off. You can even let the watercolor dry on it if you have a color that you really like. And next time you go to paint, just add water and it will come back to life. Sometimes you can even take a little bit of paper towel and wipe off the top of the watercolor and it'll get it clean enough. And lastly, check out this cool GIF a student made of me telling you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. So if you like any of the tips and tricks that I gave you, please subscribe. If you would like a video that I don't already have on my channel, please let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to make one. Happy painting!